Welcome back to the Investor Professor podcast. This is Dr. Ryan Peckham, and this is episode 60. So a couple people have written in asking how do you go about finding ideas for new investments? And so today I'm going to do the dangerous task of walking you through how I look for new investment ideas and kind of what my process is. And hopefully it'll be beneficial for you on your journey to find your next best investment. So get your mind right and let's get to work. Well, as always, welcome back to the show, everybody. Just kind of a normal week on Wall Street this past week. Not a whole lot going on, but there was some news on Friday that is pretty interesting, and that is that Warren Buffett and Berkshire Hathaway got authorization to buy 50% to increase their stake to 50% of Occidental Petroleum. Right now, they have 20%. And so, of course, on that news, the stock spiked pretty good on Friday, and it is now up to $71. So not a bad year for them. They started the year at $30 a share and have definitely spiked. But of course, with Warren backing it, everybody feels a little bit more comfortable. So as I said in the beginning, one of the most asked questions that is submitted is, how do you go about finding different investment ideas to start to kind of look at that are less than the obvious ones? And so I'm going to start this by saying I'm not your financial advisor. Speak to yours. This is for entertainment purposes only. But one of the things that you have to start doing when you look to, and this is really before you start looking at the financials, before you start looking at the balance sheets and the income statements of companies, it's just a general, how do you think about the world, how things are connected, looking at where things are going to go. And I'm not talking about being a fortune teller, but it's just kind of like just the way you view things. And so when I go about looking at where I want to maybe kind of investigate other companies, is I really just sit there and start thinking about where do I think things will go? And so this Occidental Petroleum one, there's been a lot of stuff on oil and gas this year. And obviously Russia invading Ukraine sparked that. I mean, all this stuff, but that's not necessarily going to be something that's going to be long-term. And it's not something that you can really kind of look out 5 years from now and be able to predict where it is. I'm also in a very heavily oil and gas centered area. And so I kind of keep my oil and gas exposure smaller than probably I normally would, because a lot of my clients have a lot of exposure to that area anyways. But I will say, there are times when you can take advantage of that. I mean, I talked about Occidental Petroleum when oil was minus $40 a barrel, and it looked like, it was just horrific for the oil and gas business. That was the perfect time to kind of go in there and look at things you could buy. You could buy Oxy for almost $15 a share. And we did that for a number of people. And that has turned out to be, more of a lucky than good type investment. But if we're looking at kind of where the world is right now, and we just want to look out and say, okay, how do we think things are going? What are the industries that we think are going to keep doing well? And there's low-hanging fruit on that, right? There's Amazon and there's Apple, and there's these products that we depend on in our life on a day-to-day basis. And those are kind of they've almost become like the Coca-Cola, Hershey's of the tech world. I mean, those are kind of easy ones. But when you think about things that might be a little harder, one thing I did last weekend was just look at kind of some of the data that's out there. So one of the things that was passed right by Congress, and if you kind of look at what the government's doing, look at where they're putting money, right? So you go and you look and you see where the government is kind of putting their money in. What industries are they trying to beef up, if you will? And so they did that infrastructure deal on microchips and looking to have microchips be built in the United States. And how is that going to impact different areas of the country? So if you start there, so I think about that. I think about electronic vehicles. I think about, how is that going to impact the United States? Well, when you look at electronic vehicles, you start looking at, charging stations, right? So I'm just going to kind of take you on this path. So one of the things that I looked at was, if you're looking at, that infrastructure bill, where's the building for that going to be? Well, there's going to be companies that have to build buildings and warehouses or wherever they're going to build these things. They got to build them somewhere. So you look at that and you look that, Intel has already said that they're going to invest a ton of money in Ohio to build a factory. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that I want to invest in Intel. They've had issues. I mean, you put your money in Intel 5 years ago and it's the same amount of money today. But you look at that and you say, they're going to have, let's say they're going to have to employ people there. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. Everybody in the U.S. is having trouble finding well-qualified people. So then I started thinking about, what about robots? Right? So you start going down that path, and that leads you to a company called ABB. So ABB is a industrial company based out of Zurich, Switzerland. And their main business is that they do like industrial robots, right? So they're looking at automation for these manufacturing facilities to have these robots that build this. And I go, that seems interesting. That seems like something that I might need to come back to. So I write down ABB. And that's the name of the company, and that's the symbol. So it makes it easy. So I write down ABB, and I'm just sitting there kind of just looking and looking at how this goes. And so I think, so there's probably going to be some industrial robots. And then I start thinking about, what about charging stations? Right? So if you have electronic vehicles, and obviously Tesla makes their own charging stations, but what about the Ford Lightning and just so I start looking through there, and I do a Google search on who are the largest companies that build charging stations. And when you do that, there's a company named ChargePoint that's going to be number one. And then interesting enough, you look at number 2 and 3, it's Shell, the oil company, and BP, the other oil company. And they're doing a lot of them in Europe. They're like turning their gas stations into half gas, half electric, which I think is pretty proactive of them. And then number 4 is ABB. Again, it shows up. Not only do they do industrial robots, but they're also doing charging stations. So I make note of that. And then I go back up to ChargePoint, and I do a quick Google search on ChargePoint. I'm looking at who are the people that have invested in ChargePoint, or the companies that have invested. Well, lo and behold, one of the companies that has invested in ChargePoint is Chevron. And I say, wow, that's interesting. And then there's an article a little while ago. This is August 9th, so my timing was pretty good on this, that Starbucks has announced that they're going to partner with ChargePoint to put charging stations at Starbucks stores from a route that goes from Denver to Seattle, 1,350 miles, where they're gonna put these charging stations at Starbucks for about, I don't know, 15 Starbucks between those locations. And I thought, well, wow, that's pretty interesting. And so you just start to think about what the world or what the country is going to look like in a couple years. And this is a great pivot for Starbucks, right? Because when you think about, like, you know, not to be rude or anything, but I mean, you look at Starbucks, I mean, it's a pivot. I mean, it's a great pivot, right? Because that route is probably going to be, they've done their homework. They know who their customers are. Their customers probably buy electronic vehicles more likely than somebody who shops at Sam's Club. And so you look at this and you go, wow, that's pretty good, because I think it takes about, right now, don't quote me on this, but I think it takes around 20 to 25 minutes to get like an 80% charge on most of these charging stations, and perfect amount of time for somebody to go into a Starbucks, get a drink, go to the restroom, whatever, come back out and their car's ready to go. So it's a great value add for Starbucks, and it's great for ChargePoint because it gives them legitimacy and gives them a great location to put these things. So you just start looking at this and you think, man, 3 years from now, what's this going to look like? Now, obviously, 3 weeks from now, it's not going to make that big of a difference. But when you stretch your time horizon and you're not worried about what's going to happen, and you can kind of just sit and just think about, how the world's going to go. I mean, this is going to be something that is definitely going to have to be considered and well thought out, because there's going to have to be charging stations around the country in order for the electronic vehicles to really get scale and move. And so I know there's a lot of, people who think that the electronic vehicles aren't going to last, that they're not going to, all this stuff. But you can go back. It's funny. You go back to the early 1900s and you can see, politicians running for office that ran on, saying that the railroad was dangerous. It's really quite funny. You'll see these ads of people saying, you don't want New They're in your backyard, and they're like in Philadelphia. And it'll say, you don't want New York in your backyard, vote no for the railroad. And so the railroad changed the country, right? So when you look at this, and then you also look at, okay, so electronic vehicles, what else goes into them? Well, obviously one of the big components is the batteries, and one of the components for the batteries is lithium. And so you look at that. There's a symbol of a company, SQM. It's based in Chile. It has a really complicated name, and I don't know enough Spanish to be able to do it justice, so I'm not even going to try. But SQM is the name of the company. And you go and you look at them, and they do, you look up what they do, and they find lithium derivatives. They're a mine in Chile, looking at this, which is going to be something that it's going to have to go into these batteries. And so I did this years ago with the iPhone. And so you look at a great phone like the iPhone and you say, okay, what has to go into that? Right? There's a lot of parts that go into that. Now, not every component is something, a company you can invest in, but by doing that, I was able to find Skyworks. I was able to find ARM Holdings, which has now been bought out. But I mean, if they're going to sell a ton of iPhones, that means that whoever's making the parts for that iPhone is going to sell a ton of those parts. So it's about doing next level thinking and just thinking about, okay, well, how is that going to impact this? How's this going to impact that? And you just sit there and you just have to spend some time thinking about what you think's going to happen. Now, this doesn't always work out. I mean, there are a lot of investments or a lot of companies that we think are going to change the world, and so far that hasn't materialized. And so there is a level of difficulty in this, and there's also just a little bit, it's an art, it's not a science. And so, you go through there and you just kind of think about how you think things will go, and you put a little piece of your portfolio. If you think that this is right, you go look at it. So once I've done this and I start looking at the companies that are going to be focused on this, that's when I start going in and looking at the financials, trying to figure out, okay, what's the company like? What's the pros? What's the cons? For example, ChargePoint isn't profitable yet. Are they going to be able to be profitable at some point. I'll read about companies. Sometimes I find out they're private, they're not public yet. Maybe they're close. Put them on a watch list for me to come back and look at later. Looking at the habits of people that are younger than you. I mean, I think about, I'm lucky because I teach a lot of college students and interact with a lot of people who are younger and just ridiculously talented. And I think about, okay, their generation's going to use this. They're going to start making more money. That means that this is going to work. I mean, not every investment is rocket science, but when you do this, when you just kind of sit down and start thinking about an industry or where the government is putting money, how is that going to impact? Now, this doesn't always work out. Like when Trump was in office and I was looking at, the infrastructure bill they were going to do, I went and looked up companies like United Rentals and, Caterpillar and all these things, if we're going to redo roads and bridges and all that. And, that one didn't work out. But when I look at the electronic vehicle space, I just feel like it's going to be stickier. And I'm not saying that I think everybody's going to have a electronic vehicle and, or that people are going to have 2 electronic vehicles in their garage, but I can kind of see a time where you look at a couple and you have one electronic vehicle that they use in town, and maybe they have one that's a gas-powered vehicle that they use to go on longer trips. So it's really just having these thoughts to yourself and really just kind of thinking them out and kind of looking and maybe having conversations with other people to kind of figure out where the holes are. But really just, spending some time, thinking about all this stuff that's going on can be very, very helpful for you when you're looking to make new investments. And I would say one of the hardest things about this is trying to look and see if something's going to be a fad or not. And so it's one of the reasons why I kind of stay away from clothing stores as investments, unless your name's Nike or Lulu or something like that, because it changes so fast. Like, I mean, I don't have great fashion sense anyways, so I'm not keeping up with it. And, Abercrombie and things like this, I mean, 5 years go by and all of a sudden people don't want to wear that anymore. So there's different industries where it can be trickier. And then also there's just industries where like 3D printing was really hot for a while and everybody was going to have a 3D printer. And then all of a sudden nobody has a 3D printer or just certain things. So trying to make sure if something's going to be a fad or not. You might be able to make money for a little while, but you won't be able to make money for, a decade, if you will. And so that might be more of a trade instead of an investment. But that becomes, but the more time you spend just thinking about that and not really worrying about the companies and the financials and all the other stuff that comes along with it, just in general, just thinking about how things will work helps you just to start finding different companies. And you can do this in so many industries. I mean, I looked at a Boeing airplane and you look at what components, who's making the components that go into a Boeing airplane. I mean, there's a lot of companies. And this is where you can find like smaller companies that, institutions haven't necessarily discovered yet. And if you find one that does well and then the institutions discover it and you're already invested, I mean, it's like lightning in a bottle. And that's when you can have just a massive amount of returns. And so it's really that second, third level thinking that really has to be done to try to figure that out. So I hope this is helpful for you, just kind of going over that process. I know this isn't a too in-depth of an episode, but it is a question that keeps coming up. And so I hope this is helpful for you just to kind of see what the process looks like. And then once you've done that, then you can kind of go deeper and look at some of the financials like we've discussed, look at the balance sheet, look at the income statement, and then try to figure out, okay, is this something that is actually investable that I think that I can make some money on? Also, reading helps so much. I mean, I read 3 to 4 different newspapers on a daily basis, and I go through there and I look for the small articles that like maybe people are missing. And that's where you can sometimes find like these sometimes they do these deal announcements like the Starbucks and ChargePoint. Like, it's not something that's going to make like front page, but it's kind of tucked in there. So, you got to do your homework, do a little digging, and you can find some really good opportunities out there. So I hope this is helpful for you. Look forward to your questions, and we can go deeper into this if you want, but wanted to cover this today. So I hope you have a great week, and I'll see you next time. Thanks, everybody.